This is your chapter review, Government 2306, Texas Government Chapter Reviews for chapters 19, 20, and 21. Chapter review for chapter 19 is entitled Texas Elections and Voting. Texas Elections and Voting. What we know, in the state of Texas, the Secretary of State is in charge of all of our elections. We just came out of an election. The Secretary of State is responsible for our elections. It is an appointed position by the governor, and it serves as long as the governor desires. So the governor could change his mind and say, I want somebody else in there, and then that's just that. But the Secretary of State for the state of Texas keeps all the records and pays for elections. What type of elections do we have? Well, we just came out of an election cycle, so this should be very interesting to you. We have what's known as the primary. Primary is what happened before you get your final candidates, unless there happens to have to be a runoff. So in the primary, you get to choose which candidate. We're primary a two-party system, which means we have two parties, Democrat and Republican. And so during the primary season, those candidates are chosen. The election is held the first Tuesday of March of any of our even number years. So this was 2020. So during the primary cycle for president, as well as any state offices that were open and any national offices that were open, we had our primary season and we voted back in March for who would represent that particular party during the general election. First thing that a candidate has to do if they want to run is they need to file a filing fee, and then they start campaigning. For our senator seat that was on the Democratic side, neither candidate got the majority, so there had to be a runoff. So there was a runoff in June between MJ Hegar and Royce West to determine which one of those two candidates will go up against the Republican incumbent, John Cornyn. In June, that happened, and MJ Hegar beat out Royce West, so that's who went up against John Cornyn, and subsequently she lost to John Cornyn. So she lost to him in the general election. So you have the primary election, general election follows the primary, candidate run against each other, Democratic candidate runs against the Republican candidate. If there's any independents in our state, they have to have a certain amount of signatures to be able to be on the ballot. Sometimes there's something called a special election, and those can happen throughout the course of the year. Usually, a special election takes place if the state needs to borrow some money, if candidates resign in the middle of their term. So the governor, we will have to have a special election to fill that seat. And another special election happens when we want to amend the Constitution. So these numbers are a little old, but not as bad. Texas voters, Texas is 50% of voter turnout in the country. What that means, and Beto O'Rourke, when he was running, he made it very clear that Texas is not red or blue, it's a non-voting state. There are millions of registered people that could be eligible to vote that don't register. And so they just don't vote. So that's why we have such a low turnout. Texas ranks 48 out of 50 in the general election. If it's a non-presidential year, it's even worse than that. So in the midterms, our voting percentages are even lower than that. And so we've had two elections since this was printed, and I'm sure Professor Newman has probably updated some of these numbers. I just don't have them yet, but you can go and find them on any document around voter participation in the state. So when we talk about elections and voting, there's several types. There's the primary election, there's general election, there's special elections. First thing to do before you can even vote is that you have to be a registered voter. How do you know if you're registered? You can go to the Secretary of State's homepage, type in a few pieces of information to find out if you're registered to vote. If you were not eligible to vote in this last election, trust me, there's one coming up again in 2 years. On a local level, there's probably a city council position or even a school board position that might be available in the next 2 years as well. So be on the lookout for those sorts of opportunities where you can participate in the voting process. So this was chapter 19 on elections and voting.